first and foremost, in the Philadelphia Photo Arts Center for the invitation. As I mentioned before, I've been a huge fan of the programming and the work that you guys do. So it's definitely an honor to be, included and being affiliated with the institution. So we'll go ahead and start.
Oh, forgive me. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem.
Sorry. Carry on.
Go ahead and share my screen. All right, can you see this okay? You're muted.
It looks great.
Okay, great. All right, so again, I'm Larry Cook. As you stated in my bio, I consider myself as a conceptual artist, which is in a lot of ways has been more of a evolution. So I do work across, stage photographic practices, appropriation, video art, installation. So what I would like to do is kind of start a little bit, kind of give a bit of a summary of the span of my work, and then go into what I've been working on recently and in relationship to carceral aesthetics, carceral spaces, and prison photography. So this series, or this photo here, is titled All American. And this was really a pivotal point in my development as a photographer. Starting off, I was primarily a portrait documentary photographer, I would say. But then I got to this point where there was so much that I wanted to say, and I wanted to find other strategies in kind of communicating my ideas. So one strategy I began to work through was staging photographs and kind of thinking through conceptually in relationship to my photographic practice. So this was kind of diversion from my previous work. And this piece was really in response to what I saw was the disparity between racially motivated violence and Black on Black violence. And it was specifically with the incident with the murder of Trayvon Martin. And I just remember having a lot of conversations, a lot of dialogues around what was happening, the media response, the response from activists and political leaders. And so I wanted to really take what I saw was the face of these various groups and put them on the same level and allow the viewer to really wrestle with the connections, this juxtaposition. And as we began to dive deeper, obviously the first thing that stood out was the red, white, and blue, but also how this is a representation of American subculture, and this being a byproduct of marginalized groups. And one of my photographers in terms of inspiration, August Sander, and the way that he shoots democratically. And I tried that approach. I've always tried to keep that approach in my own photographic work, no matter the subject. So this is all staged, which is I always have to kind of preface that, because people assume that, especially if the Klansmen being real, but it was all staged, all from the the clothing, setting up in various locations. Just a quick backstory: the Klansman was a former professor of mine, James Huckenfeller, who I had to get this this suit tailor made to fit him specifically. So,
Wow.
but it was, it just kind of reflected the, just, the trust in my creative vision uh, having him being part of this project. And the other two, one is my uncle and my cousin as well. So oftentimes, a lot of my photographic work, especially that whether it's portraiture or if it's staged, I tend to rely on family and friends. And part of it is because of that trust factor, which I think is always really important and comes across in the photographs. So this is a triptych. Each photograph is 40 by 50 inches. Um, so I'll go on to the next piece. So this is a neon work. Some of my best friends are Black. So again, I'm just really in a space, working through different media. I didn't want to necessarily place myself within a particular box aesthetically. And, I was in a really experimental space and stepping out, moving away from, photography a bit. So this piece is really in response to what I see as kind of like a commercialization of a certain type of pandering. So whether it's some of my best friends are Black or some of my best friends are Muslim, I mean, you can replace Black with any particular term. And, it's kind of this, it's always like this kind of unsolicited response to show that you're not racist or have a certain prejudice towards a certain group. And again, going back to the commercialization in reference to advertisement as it relates to neon. Also occasionally do video art. It's been kind of more, I would say, sporadic over the years, much more frequent in beginning of my career. And I always saw, video as a way to kind of certain ideas that I just couldn't communicate through still images. And then if there was certain material that I came across that I was just really inspired by, and I was, going through, working through, various archives and wanted to depict Dr. King in a different light, one that was much more intimate. So I'm gonna play this video. It's a silent video. It's about 40 seconds. So it's a single channel video, one that is looped. I've displayed it in various presentations, from video projections to TV monitors, and till this date is still one of my favorite pieces. and one thing that's pretty consistent often throughout my work is this minimalist approach. And I think it kind of goes back to the way that I photograph, and no matter the different material and the way that I present it, those formal qualities always tend to kind of carry over. Though as I mentioned earlier, I identify as a conceptual artist. At the core, I'm still a portrait photographer. Um, that's where I began, and when I'm inspired, I always kind of go back to that. And this was a series that is, ongoing, which I began in 2018 when I discovered that I was, going to be a father myself. And, we're just going through a lot of different emotions, excitement and anxiety, and began to reflect on my own childhood, the various father figures within my own upbringing. So I began having conversations with friends and family members. And up until this point, it had been at least, I want to say, about a year and a half without making any particular portraits. The direction I was in, it was a lot of like text-based art, as I mentioned, video and installation. So this was also kind of like a return to form, so to speak. And for me, I was really interested in this, kind of expressing this vulnerability and strength within everyday fathers. And this image, I think, really encapsulates that very well. A lot of things kind of just came together. It was one of those series where I had all of the images already in my head, and it was really just kind of finding subjects and environment to kind of match that. One thing that I didn't anticipate when I got to this location, so it's taken in the backyard of my uncle's house, is the punching bag. So we kind of talked through what it means to be a father, what it means to him, and then we're also talking through what do we want this image to represent, how do you want to be represented from the clothing to what your daughter is wearing. What I knew is that I wanted to have something that represents a certain element of masculinity and strength, which is obviously in his physique, one, but the Gold's Gym shirt, the work boots, and again, the thing I didn't plan for, which ended up working really well, was the punching bag. But wanting to have that element, vulnerability, obviously, with his daughter and the pink book bag. And, it's always interesting photographing children, so you kind of pose the subject, and then you just wait for the child for that right moment. And kind of this hand being out there, in a way she's being, just as protective of him as he is of her. And like I said, it's an ongoing series, so it also kind of reflects where some of my portrait work is currently. So I wanted to kind of get into the topic of my presentation, reframing the carceral space. I had two uncles that were incarcerated. They both did about 10 years apart in separate penitentiaries. And when I would say maybe around between 15 and 21, we began to write each other pretty frequently, and exchange photographs. In a lot of ways, it was as they were getting to the tail end of their sentence, and kind of it was kind of like a reintroduction, because I had known them as a young child, but it was so much of a span that I only knew them through photographs and stories, and it was also kind of a beginning to this, being introduced to this prison vernacular, in terms of the Polaroid and the physical photograph, and also began to recognize the importance of the archive and how it operates very differently within this space. One of the things they were always adamant about was sending pictures. And I would try to send money, and it's like, don't worry about sending money, just send photographs. That's all we want to see. And obviously in that environment, that's their only connection to the outside world. And at that time, Facebook was really the most popular form of sharing images. Going out to events and having your point and shoot and uploading it directly to Facebook. But I would take those images and print them out specifically for them. So when they were released, they would go around with these photo albums of all the pictures that they've collected during their time in prison, and it was their most prized possession. Just the stories, the fellow inmates. I was just really inspired by this particular archive. And at the same time, I was being introduced to a German photographer, Joachim Schmidt, who was also working with an archive in a very different manner. But that kind of inspiration, or his work, kind of showed me the potential and range in working with found photography and archival images. So I began, going through their albums and scanning various images, and trying to produce a series of works. One of the things that began to stood out was, the sense of brotherhood, and obviously, the pose being really important. So I began trying to find particular threads and trying to narrow down to various diptychs and triptychs. So I began, looking at similarities in the background in terms of lighting, and also in the pose. But one thing that I was wrestling with, was, even though I thought these images were just incredible, I didn't want to kind of feed into a certain type of stereotype as it relates to Black men specifically. So I started to kind of think through, from a more kind of intimate perspective. And one of the first pieces that I arrived on was this triptych. So this series is called When Dad Comes Home. So it shows my uncle over a span of time with his son. So obviously looking at various formal elements, in terms of, the visiting room, the tile floor, the checker tile floor, the escapist backdrop, the way that they're posing together. So in part, it's about fatherhood and thinking about fatherhood from a different perspective. You think about, men being separated from the children and being out of their lives, but you have this other side of this narrative where a lot of them fight to maintain their relationships. And, those relationships are vital to their survival within these spaces. So this work started to become about time, um, relationships as it, relates to the carceral space, and how, family, and brotherhood is, again, just really essential to the well-being and survival. So again, this also was the beginning of, investigating the archive, which would later on, reemerge in later work. So after working, with those found materials, or my family's prison archives. But then I just went through a span of working in different ways, a lot of various staged approaches in photography, a lot of it in relationship to, race and identity. And then I got to a point where I was just kind of fatigued and being in that space in a way that everything was very politically driven. A lot of the research, a lot of the conversations were centered around that. It was also a time where back in 2016, 2017, there was beginning to, a lot of video footage of police shootings, and I just needed to have a break from that. And I was invited to do a residency, the Savage Lewis residency on Martha's Vineyard. And thinking about, what I wanted to do for that 1 month on the island, began to think back to, I guess, my origins. In a lot of ways. My first photography gig was a club photographer in the DC club scene. And, we set up these makeshift photo booths, these surrealist, materialistic backdrops. And, people would pay me to have their photo taken. So as I began to, study photography more, I began to realize how important this particular practice is. Even though it's not recognized in the larger canon of photography, I thought that it was an opportunity to do so in trying to kind of elevate this form of image making. So it really began with the backdrops themselves. I had a few backdrops from my time as a club photographer. I began reaching out to various photographers that I've known in that particular industry and started collecting those backdrops. Just again, going back to the archive and understanding the value of various materials. So it's just as a kind of visual exercise and really being inspired by the island, I just began setting up these backdrops in various locations. It was also a change for me as well, because again, a lot of my photography was centered around, the portrait and the figure. So I was able to kind of get into landscape photography. And, one of my favorite photographers is William Christenberry. And, to kind of seeing those particular structures within those landscapes and the color juxtaposition, that formal approach, in some ways, I was thinking about it in relationship to, setting up these backdrops. But in a lot of ways, they're portraits of the backdrops, really. So it kind of speaks towards this sense of nostalgia, and as this form of image making, isn't as popular as it was, especially in the 80s and 90s, and it began to kind of die out, especially with the emergence of social media in the early 2000s. So as I'm, working through collecting these backdrops, though when I was shooting, everything was digital. I would shoot it on a DSLR, printing on a inkjet printer. I started thinking back towards, the Polaroids that, my mom and dad and uncles would have of their time going to, various events and taking these images in front of backdrops. So I began expanding my archive from the backdrops to the actual Polaroids themselves. And I knew I wanted to work through them. I just wasn't quite sure what would be my strategy. I didn't want it to focus a lot on identity in terms of specific people within these Polaroids. So this particular book that I came across by an author named Krista Thompson, Shine, the Visual Economy of Light. And it was the only scholarly material I can find around club photography and club photography aesthetics. And she would refer to this type of photography as the bling bling aesthetic. This high culture, very materialistic, performative kind of way of taking images or having your photo taken, and which is a really great way to think about it. Because even as my time as a photographer, getting in front of the backdrop, it was all about this sense of this spectacle and kind of creating this environment of agency, but also having everyone kind of look at you. And so again, going back to the bling bling aesthetic, I began to work through these glitter sheets. And so that solved various problems for me. One, allowing them to remain primarily faceless, but also be able to really, insinuate the posturing and the pose that is so, performative in this mode of image taking. So coming from, shooting the backdrops within the landscapes to having the actual, working through the Polaroids, I began to think through back to the images of my uncles and how there was this overlap or connection between prison photography aesthetics and club photography aesthetics, especially within the escapist backdrops, painted backdrops, and also how the pose is used as a form of agency. So this allowed me to kind of think about reintroducing the figure, which began with this particular series. Excuse me, the previous series is titled High Rollers, which is named after a backdrop that I used to have. I wish I still had it. It was one of my favorite money-making backdrops. But this series is titled The Visiting Room. So as I began to, I couldn't find any scholarship that actually talked about the connections between prison photography and club photography. So I realized this was just, a great opportunity to kind of root my practice within these particular aesthetics. And, one scholar I came across, writer and curator Pete Brook, who has a particular blog, has so much information around prison photography and prison aesthetics. And I began to realize that there was so much material around prison photography specifically. And at the same time, I was introduced to a scholar, Dr. Nicole Fleetwood, who wrote extensively around this topic and introduced the term carceral aesthetics. So I wanted to kind of, again, reimagine it from a very conceptual um, framework. So one of the ways, again, through staged approach, one thing that I wanted to do differently was have them faceless and turning away from the camera. So part of it was wanting to push against the gaze, so to speak, that's often associated with mugshot photography, but also think about having them engage with the backdrop as well. So in a lot of ways, it's performative, but then in this case, thinking about it from a narrative point of view, but also allowing the viewer to place themselves within the space and kind of imagine, looking out into, these kind of landscapes, even though it's makeshift, in terms of internalizing the subject. And this work, again, allowed me to kind of pull together a lot of different aspects of my practice. Again, from the stage element. So a lot of these are, again, family members and friends. It goes back to the images of of my uncles and their archive. These backdrops are primarily are club photography backdrops. So being able to kind of repurpose them within this kind of aesthetic. And this work was part of the Marking Time Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration exhibition at MoMA PS1, which was curated by Dr. Nicole Fleetwood. And, really just the response to this work was just really motivating and inspiring, and wanting to, move forward and continuing to explore and reimagine and recontextualize prison photography aesthetics in a way to kind of elevate, again, this largely vernacular practice that's kind of on the outside of mainstream photography, and through kind of my conceptual approach, hopefully, along with many other artists, introduce it into the mainstream canon of photography.
Larry?
Yes.
Oh, those are, oh, okay, good. I wanted to see if those were from the other work, the Polaroids. Thanks.
So, working through the archives, especially with the club Polaroids, I also began to develop an archive and collecting prison Polaroids as well. And I had a small collection, through what I collected from my uncles, but I began going through different, whether it was auction houses, online, family members, friends. I just began, collecting these Polaroids, and with the intent of kind of collaging them in a way that, on one hand, kind of kept the integrity of the image. I didn't want it to just be really exploitive, so to speak. So I sat on these images for a good amount of time, just not coming up with a really good strategy to kind of create a new body of work and again, as I mentioned, kind of maintain the sense of integrity with dealing with this material. So one solution I began working through was collecting landscape Polaroids. And then I began just as an exercise, kind of working through collaging these Polaroid landscapes within the silhouette, thinking about, the sense of freedom and how, from a spiritual standpoint and also, something that one can internalize within being in this space. And then I thought back to particular artist that I came across years ago, Michael Smoroff, who worked with photographs from August Sander in a series called Absence of Subject, in which, the iconic portraiture work of August Sander, removing the actual subjects, leaving, these landscapes and interior spaces. So I began kind of applying, and almost forgot I had this slide in here. So this is here one of August Sander's original portraits, and then this is the reappropriated image by Michael Smoroff. And I always thought that it was such a subtle gesture, but it was so powerful in a way that in a lot of ways the strength of August Sander's work. And Michael really speaks about this much more in terms of a collaboration. So I began applying that to the prison Polaroids. So I began removing the subjects or the inmates. And then what ended up happening is being left with these landscapes. And in some cases, there are certain visual cues that may point to it being in a prison. But in some cases, they look like, everyday American landscapes. I just thought that was kind of fascinating, the ambiguity that was kind of created and what was happening with the absence of the inmates. So this is the work that I'm currently focusing on. I'm also, I will be a light work artist in residence starting next month. And this will be, the focus of my work. So I have about a collection of about 200 to 300 Polaroids, and I'm looking to probably narrow it down to a series of 15 to 20. So still kind of working through all of the various layers of the work. But this is where I am currently. But I also want to talk about another project. So I was invited to do an exhibition / installation at this artist space called the Canary Test in LA. It's a fashion warehouse that was repurposed for an artist space, gallery space, and worked through various concepts and ideas, but ultimately decided to go back to thinking about carceral spaces, prison photographers. And, I have this pretty extensive collection of Polaroids, but all of the photographers are anonymous. So I thought that it would be, great to use this space as a platform to, provide or shed light on these particular photographers and allow them to tell their particular stories and narratives. And again, thinking about them taking their place within the larger canon of photography. So, going back to Pete Brook, who eventually ended up developing a relationship. We ended up having a conversation around photography and teaching that was published in Daylight last fall. And he connected me with a photographer that was formerly incarcerated, and that kind of snowballed into various other connections. So, we are working with the folks at Canary Tests, setting up this space, uh, inviting the photographers, flying them in. So we had our first photographer who came in this Saturday. So every Saturday over the next 4 weeks, there will be a photographer coming in and taking a self-portrait. So they take these self-portraits, they edit and print the portraits on the spot. And after all the shooting is done, the portraits will be framed and hung in the space. And we'll have a formal exhibition. So this was also a really, in a lot of ways, an important project. It kind of started off about, in a lot of ways, kind of centered around me. But then it kind of evolved to kind of stepping back and not having any of my work in the space, and just looking at this more in terms of a collaboration. And I hope to continue these kind of initiatives and projects. The photographers are all on the West Coast, with the exception of one. They all did time in San Quentin. So I'm hoping that we could bring, photographers out of obscurity from all over and do similar projects such as this. And this particular project is titled Wherever There Is Light. So that's what I've been working on currently, and that's my presentation.
Thank you. I really appreciate you and the work you're doing. I love this current project out there. Are you there when they're photographing?
No.
Yeah.
I wish. But I'm able to actually see it because the Canary Test, part of the space is that the actual space is always on camera, essentially. So there's this live feed on the website 24 hours. So I was able to, kind of see a little bit as he was shooting on Saturday. But, I had various conversations with the photographers. We had Zoom calls together. And we're going to fly them back out to the space, and I will fly out as well for the actual opening.
Well, we live in Philadelphia, or some of us live in Philadelphia, and now my mind is going.
There you go.
It's pretty great. Are there any questions? I have questions, but I also want to open the floor to anybody in the audience. You can either unmute yourself or put a question in the chat. Oh, go ahead, Juno.
Hi, Larry. Your work is fascinating. I love it. My question, what's sticking with me is this contrast between the fantasies that are created between the club backdrops and the inside the prison backdrops compared to the reality of either of those. What is being sold to folks about the realities of prison, compared to any other fantasy, which I think that's the real thing. So I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit more to that, and if you were thinking about that in this process.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the things that begins to jump out as you begin to navigate through those archives and see those similarities. But I think it just really points to, the use of the backdrop in photography, thinking about having various landscapes and cityscapes at a time where photography wasn't as mobile, shooting with a 4x5. And as technology changed, those backdrops weren't as prominent. So, that intent really just kind of carries over and evolves in various spaces, whether it's studio photography, prison photography, or club photography.
Oh, Harmony, your work is so thoughtful and intentional. Thank you for uplifting the voices and experiences of BIPOC. How have the events of this past year impacted your craft and your teaching approach and principles with your students, especially being in such close proximity geographically to events such as the Capitol riot?
I think just over the past 2 years with the pandemic, one, not being able to go out and shoot forced me to really pay more closer attention to the archives that I had. So working with it really gave me time to kind of work through certain ideas and concepts, specifically with the prison Polaroids. But I think in terms of, I just began to, I look at my practice as a way, when there are various elements happening in society, my practice becomes like a safe space for me. So I kind of begin to really emerge within that. And in a lot of ways is really kind of diving within myself. Because I think that a lot of what's happening, obviously there are tons of questions that are raised, but I begin to kind of think about, my place within the world, where I fit in terms of photography, my role as an educator, and you begin to really just appreciate those things and also understand the privilege, being in a position of privilege, being a professor and being in that space and just taking it more seriously and pouring a lot more into it. So between my practice and being a professor, I mean, it's a lot of it kind of just goes hand in hand. A lot of it is a lot of overlap between the projects and allowing my students to participate. I have this project that I'm working on for a museum exhibition that opens up next year. And, one of my former students is going to assist me, on the project. And so a lot of it is just, just again, just not taking for granted the privileged position that I'm in.
If I may, let me know, put your hand up or unmute yourself, but I do have a question. Oh, Paolo, please ask your question.
Hi, Larry. I noticed in some of the photographs in the archive and some of the photographs against the backdrops that many feature men. Can you speak about the role of men in your photographs?
Yeah, in terms of just men in general, like a lot of my work started with, well, it kind of varies. A lot of my photography early on centered around single mothers, and with the intent of wanting to come back around and show the other side in terms of fatherhood. But I think it's just in relationship to the material. I haven't been able to come across hardly any prison archives that feature women. Obviously my introduction and connection came through my uncles. So it was kind of just a natural progression in that regard. But also I'm always, really aware of representation. And honestly, with the club photography, it's a tricky balance, because I again, there's certain parameters that I want to operate within. And, I have children. I want to be able to have work that they can view as well. And so I think also just the nature of that particular form of image making in the stuff that I've come across, you know, I had to just make real important decisions in terms of what I choose to kind of represent. And, you know, if you want to kind of get a sense of that, if you look at, there's another photographer out of New Orleans, who's really prominent in terms of his archive of being a club photographer, named Polo Silk. And, you know, his work is amazing in referencing and capturing, you know, the culture of bounce music and, you know, the club aesthetic within New Orleans. But, you know, I wouldn't be comfortable, quite honestly, in working through some of those materials. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Mine is kind of related. It just struck me, and I felt like your work unveiled something that I hadn't thought about, was these photographs of the men in groups and the way their arms are all circled, even in their bodies, but they also create a circle. And of course, it's about the brotherhood, and there's so much beauty and love and support and strength in those spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And then right after that, you said the word stereotype and not fitting into a stereotype. And that really struck me, it kind of jarred me loose. I guess, could you speak a little bit more about just the gesture that means one thing, you know, and is interpreted, you know, and how you were really cautious about that?
Yeah. I mean, you know, the pose, as author Richard Majors describes as the cool pose, which is in a lot of ways, it's a form of posturing, is a tool to communicate power and detachment and toughness. Now, obviously, within this environment, that's extremely important in terms of negotiating these kind of environments. But also, those visuals have often been used to, you know, vilify and stereotype, you know, Black men. So it's always it's a tough balance in trying to negotiate the material. You know, part of it, again, is why one of the reasons why I chose to for the visiting room to have them faceless, you know, or even with the diptychs and triptychs with my uncles, to, you know, whether it's a letter between the two, him with the son, to kind of show, you know, a different side of that. And all of it is just a way of thinking through this form of, you know, this vernacular in a way that elevates, recontextualize, and allow people to reconsider it in a different perspective.
We have time for one more question. Does anybody else have anything to ask? I feel like I just feel like I learned a lot. Thank you very much tonight. Thank you. I feel like there's lots to think about. What was the name of the author that described the pose?
Richard Majors. His book is called Cool Pose: The Dilemma of Black Manhood.
Thanks. Do you think your work will expand to the female population? That Emmanuel writes that.
I think so. I think it's will be in a lot of ways a natural progression. You know, I did an exhibition in Berlin last summer, and part of the actual catalog featured an essay from a woman who was formerly incarcerated, and talking about her experience. And she shared some of her photos within the actual catalog as well. So I just think is, you know, gain more exposure and hopefully have a wider net in terms of various archives, whether it's through, you know, pen pile or just coming in contact with various folks that hopefully I can develop a vast enough archive to kind of work through to produce work.
Well, it's 8 o'clock. Good luck with the work and good luck with the residency. I think it sounds like a great time and a great project to be working on. Thank you all for coming tonight. And I hope to see you next week. Odette England and, oh darn, I forgot. Hang on. Mark Alice Durant are going to be in conversation about her next book. So I hope you can come back. Thank you, Larry. And we're super glad you could come tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Have a good night, y'all. That's new. That's weird.